Chris Jericho, who is a fellow wrestler, has his own podcast show called Dog is Jericho. And on that podcast, he told a bizarre story about working with Chris. And during a match, Chris Jericho slightly botched a spin kick, selling a move that had barely touched him. The spot would have happened so fast that barely anybody would have noticed anyway. But the mistake would have weighed heavily on Chris Benoit. Chris Jericho said that after the match, he found Chris Benoit backstage because he went looking for him and couldn't find him anywhere. He said that he found him in the boiler room doing squats. And Chris Jericho said to Benoit, "What are you doing?" And Benoit said, "You know, I never should have bumped off that. That was so unprofessional of me, and it was such a bad rookie mistake. I had to do squats." He did 500 squats, and purging himself for making that mistake. You know, when you hear things like that, you kind of equate it to the last few days. There were a lot of issues with him that were going on mentally. It was very odd behavior that he thought that he would have to put himself through physical pain because of a botched spot that nobody even noticed. It shows what his mindset was. In 1997, going back in time a little bit to when he met his wife, Chris started dating Nancy. Nancy was a fellow talent known in the WCW as Woman. How Chris and Nancy got together is perhaps a story that could only happen in the wrestling business. Nancy was married to Kevin Sullivan at the time, who was Chris's boss. Kevin booked the storyline of his own wife starting an on-screen relationship with Chris Benoit, and much to his surprise, the storyline became a reality, and Nancy did actually start dating Chris in real life. It has become a wrestling legend that Kevin booked his own divorce. Chris had a 22-year-long career in wrestling. In those 22 years, he often exhibited toxic behavior. was here that he'd get his most famous moniker, the Crippler. The nickname was cemented when he wrestled Sabu on November 2nd, 1994. The match, the main event of the show, ended just after 2 minutes. When Chris threw Sabu into a face-first bump, Sabu miscalculated and tried to change direction mid-air, causing him to land directly on his neck. Sabu broke his neck, causing damage to his spinal cord and nervous system. Paul Heyman, a wrestling manager, found Chris hiding in a closet after that incident, rocking back and forth, weeping uncontrollably at what had just happened. He was terrified that he had crippled Sabu in the ring. Paul had to physically pick Chris up off the ground and send him to the hospital along with Sabu. The event was clearly traumatic for Chris. However, Paul took advantage of the accident and used the footage, which would become infamous and one of the most replayed spots in ECW history, to push Chris even further, using it to emphasize the Crippler nickname. Eddie Guerrero was another famous WWE wrestler. He died suddenly from a heart attack at the age of 38. He had an underlying health condition. Chris and Eddie were longtime friends and even considered each other to be brothers. Eddie's sudden death broke Chris. A friend at the funeral comforted Chris with a hug and described it as the most desperate, saddest, I'm hanging on for life hugs that you could ever get. Chris's grief for Eddie was plain to see on the tribute show on Monday Night Raw. He was visibly crushed. Chris's wife Nancy told Vicky Guerrero, Eddie's wife, that Eddie's death was really affecting him in so many ways. Chris decided to stay out of the public eye after Eddie's death, and even started shutting himself off from his own family and friends, and that he started a journal to work through his depression at losing Eddie, but it was all too late. Upon Eddie's death, Chris considered quitting WWE altogether. Chris, led by Nancy, began to consider alternate career options outside of the WWE and settled on the idea of starting a wrestling school in Atlanta. Chris and Nancy began developing business ideas for the school and even had merch made. After Eddie's death, Chris was still heavily involved in the WWE. He never took any time off, and he was still booked in big storylines and angles, including being booked for an ECW World Championship match on the day that he died. Any potential retirement seemed like a long ways off. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about steroids. It was just a part of the game, and it was speculated that Chris had abused the steroids for almost 30 years. Nancy had a low opinion of the WWE wellness program. In text found on Chris's phone, Nancy said, "I will not accept this steroid-induced rollercoaster ride of emotional abuse. Ignoring the problem or running away isn't going to help you face it. You need professional help, and only if you're fully honest about all of it. Get off of this stuff. I'm probably not the only one who can see, and we both know the wellness program is a joke." In a criminal case against Dr. Phil Aston, Chris's personal physician, it was revealed that Dr. Phil Aston's prescription too far exceeded the normal amount for a testosterone disorder and was well above the normal dose. The discovery of Chris's steroid abuse led many to believe, especially the mainstream media, that roid rage was the reason Chris snapped and unalived his family. However, Chris's father still thinks it was another element of wrestling which was responsible for Chris's downfall. Chris suffered a number of concussions during his long in-ring career. During his time in the ring, it was not uncommon for wrestlers to take unprotected chair shots to the head. Concussion protocols relaxed, and it wasn't uncommon for wrestlers to take no time off from a concussion. He told his friends that he had suffered more concussions than he could count. This sloppy protection from concussions is what led Chris's family to believe that this could be the reason for his snapping. Chris's father, Michael, turned over his son's brain to Julian Bales of the Sports Legacy Institute. Julian Bales, the head of neurosurgery at West Virginia University, studied Chris's brain and found that at the time of his death, he had the brain of an 80-year-old suffering from severe Alzheimer's disease. Damage was found in all 4 lobes of the brain and deep into the brain stem. It was extensive throughout Chris's brain. This is something that you should never see in a 40-year-old. Julian Bale said that while he can't know for sure that his brain damage is the reason for the tragedy, he does believe that it could be a leading cause. Over the weekend of June 22nd, 2007, Chris uncharacteristically missed a WWE event, though nobody could have ever imagined that a simple no-show would become one of the darkest days in wrestling history. Late at night on a Friday, Chris unalived his wife Nancy in an upstairs bedroom in their house. Nancy's limbs were bound, and her injuries showed that he had pressed his knee into her neck while pulling a cord around her neck, strangling her to death. The next morning, he drugged his 7-year-old son, Daniel, with Xanax, leaving him unconscious, and then Chris suffocated him. Chris left a copy of the Bible by each body. On that Saturday, Chris talked on the phone to his good friend, Guerrero, and told him that Nancy and Daniel were suffering from food poisoning, and something sounded off with Chris, especially with the way he said goodbye. He ended the conversation by saying, "Chavo, I love you." Nancy and Daniel would have been dead by then, by the time he made that phone call. Chris's computer search history showed that he researched the quickest WWE heard from him in over 24 hours. Guerrero showed the messages he got from Chris to WWE management. WWE then called the Fayetteville police, who discovered the 3 bodies at the house. Chris had left a handwritten note saying, "I am preparing to leave this earth." That just gave me chills. I think the downhill spiral started, and there was no saving him from himself, and no saving his family from him. And to think about his poor wife and his son. The wife, encouraging him, "Okay, it's time to move on. Let's do this together. As a team, let's go into another business together and start looking ahead to the future and get yourself together, get your health together in order." She seemed like a very supportive wife that wanted to do this with her husband, to move on, to heal, to go further in their business and in their life. And his poor baby had no idea. I mean, he was a kid, like no idea what was going on with his dad, and to think that he got at the point where he knew what he was doing to his son and then Googled how to resurrect a boy, it just breaks my heart. Wow. I can't imagine the wife's last moments and the fear that she must have experienced. And it's so scary to know what that doctor saw of his brain, and how he had the brain of an 80-year-old with extensive damage. I mean, even in football they talk about brain damage and concussions, and this is just something that's known that the players have to deal with. But wrestling, honestly, I don't know much about WWE, but I always thought that it was very much staged. But it seems very barbaric that people are actually getting hit in the head with chairs.